Chapel Hill, and they're still going too, so we
They
could.
didn't have to do it here, they should.
No, they didn't.
I thought I did it school, like here, and then we got it out to
Yeah. Channel 7, I don't know, that usually have stuff about it.
that's why I get to know that.
Well, I see it on the internet.
Sorry, I gotta browse Facebook. Make sure I'm on Facebook. Yep. Uh-oh. Is it cutting my head off again? Yeah, I'll tell you. Where's that? Where's the camera? That's the TV one. There's a camera remote somewhere.
That's moving it, I think.
Is it?
Yeah.
Gotta wait for this to catch up. Some trickster comes in here and moves my camera.
Somebody call
Just nudges. There we go. Yep. All right. Yay. Thank you.
What kind of phone is that?
That is a Galaxy S21 or something like that. Android. How about yours?
We had
Is it?
Androids, but they were just crazy. So they switched
Yeah, got a lot of people like that.
Yeah. I guess that's what was used to first.
That's a lot easier to operate.
Yeah, it works. They knocked that wall out.
Yeah, okay, Dustin, come here, come around.
Uh-oh, what'd I do? I got something on me?
Yeah, Cole's got.
Rain. You had a lot of rain coming in.
Oh, what'd I do?
Well, it's, see this one?
Whoa, that's no good.
I happen to have.
Thank you. This is why we look out for each other.
That's right.
You had a lot of rain coming in.
Just a minute.
It sprinkled on me some near Cumbie, a little after Cumbie. Like there's a period where it was like,
Oh. Use that one for the
Where'd it
next
go?
time. Yep, I got it.
Part of
I
it
think it's
is
over
over
there. Oh, right here.
Part of it's
I didn't know those could break, but evidently they can.
if it was the puzzle to get back, thank you for doing that. That was my coattail, so.
Yes, yes, always carry it. I do.
All right, good morning. Good morning. So, last time we were in 1 Corinthians, today we're still in 1 Corinthians. Go figure. We finished up chapter 6, started chapter 7 last time, so we'll do a brief review. And we'll talk about 1 Corinthians. And then in our sermon this morning, we'll talk about 1 Corinthians. So, go with what you know. So, we're going to start with prayer. Thank you, kind and merciful Father, for your blessings, for rain given, for all your goodness. Pray you'll take care of us still in all our needs, that you'll lead us in your ways, Father. You'll guide this country, that you might be honored, and that souls might be saved, that the fear of God will be learned through the execution of justice, and that men might seek you and be able to teach your will openly. Help us in our studies, Father. Be with Shane as he's away. Be with all our saints who struggle in various ways, and just help us, keep us to the end, and may our faith not fail, Father. Bless us in all. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so 1 Corinthians 6, we'll go with this right quick. We got to the last 5 or 6 verses there, and just wrap that up. Morning. So verse 15 talked about Paul is in the middle of a section on sexual immorality, and he's talking to them about there are certain things the body is obviously designed for, but there are certain things that was never meant by God to be used for. One is sexual immorality. And so he's like, no, whatever your philosophers think, whatever you think about how the body is supposed to be used, that is not what God intended. Do not be those things. He obviously holds up marriage as the ideal, that union of man and woman being a representation. It's supposed to be Christ and the church to a degree there. And so Paul will reflect that. So they were taking it and abusing it, using it in ways they should not. In chapter 7, of course, throughout like the whole chapter, he talks about marriage and things like that. So he tells in verse 18, flee immorality. Some battles you just aren't meant to fight or should not fight, especially as he would talk about in chapter 7, their lack of self-control, at least some of the Corinthians there. We talked about the Greeks not having this concept of morality being joined in service to God like Christians do and Jews did either. And so that was something they need to have their minds reset from their culture into the ways of God. Chapter 3, he talked about the church being a temple. Here in 19 and 20, or 19, he talks about them, the individual, being a temple, and how God dwells with us in a way. I don't think that means geographically. We talked about that. And so basically, our bodies, which are going to be raised like Christ was, we need to treat them in a holy and good way. Since God raised the Lord, verse 14, he will raise us up through his power. And then verse 20, we talked about the historical aspect, how they would use that phrase, I, so-and-so, have bought with a price this slave for, name some price. And so Paul is using that same phraseology that they would have been well familiar with, things that probably would have heard in the marketplace. And so he uses that to say, you have been bought with a price, therefore your behavior reflects on the Lord. Why don't you have your hand up? Okay. And so that is the tour of chapter 6. Any questions on the end of that part? Don't you want to wish it all went that fast, right? No. If y'all let me know if we do ever need to speed it up, so be it. But all right, that's chapter 6. Then we got started in chapter 7. We got to verse 10 and 11. Actually, we made some pretty good progress. So how does it start? Now concerning the things about which you wrote. So after 6 chapters of addressing all the things they apparently didn't really bring up or didn't admit to their problems, then he moves on to their questions that they had written. We obviously don't have that letter, but we can reconstruct kind of some things going on there. And that's one of the neat things about 1 Corinthians. It's made me a lot more reflective on Paul's other letters. Because, you can obviously tease out some things going on from his other letters. Galatians, you had the Judaizers, and so forth. Thessalonians, you had either them and their persecution and such. Here in 1 Corinthians, there's a lot going on. A lot of back and forth between Paul and them. A lot of suspicious-mindedness and these evil motives they ascribe to Paul. All that. And so it's neat. It's a lot more, perhaps, I think, in-depth in that regard than the other letters. Maybe not. I haven't studied the other letters, all of them like this, just the Thessalonians. So it's interesting. There's your brief aside. So 1 Corinthians 7, we got through verse 9. And so what's going on? Here is probably the most almost manual handbook on marriage and the different situations that can arise and what's expected that we see. And so Paul goes through it pretty much step by step. He starts out in verse 1 talking about it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Seems to be referring to immorality there. And so with that, he's like, but because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife and each woman is to have her own husband. That's probably talking about the spouses being faithful to each other. He's not saying you all need to go out and get married. He'll address the various situations. Here he's just talking about, and not that it didn't apply, not that marriage isn't a potential outlet for those who are struggling. But he's like, okay, spouses, you need to be faithful to each other. You need to fulfill your duties to each other. Essentially, you have authority over each other, right? Not that you didn't have authority over your own body, but you have authority over each other's body as well. Stop depriving each other. So because of their lack of self-control, because of their needs, like Paul's like, here's how you act in marriage. And so he goes to that at length. Verse 7, yet I wish that all men were even as myself am. Probably talking about the ability to be celibate. That's kind of self-control there. Each man has his own gift from God, and woman as well, of course. Verse 8, I say to the unmarried and widows, it's good for them if they remain even as I am. So probably talking about widowers and widows there in those verses. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it's better than to marry than to burden with passion, seems to be the idea. And that's through verse 9. And so he just goes with different groups of people. Are you a married person? Are you a widowed person? Are you engaged to be married? Are you whatever? And so that takes us back to where we were previously. Any questions on any of that? And we got time for questions. I'm not trying to rush us through anything. If we need to make up time, we'll try to find a way, or we just won't get finished with the book. And y'all have to have Saturday school with me and we'll get through it. So any questions up to now on this or anything else? Okay. Someone please read. If your Bible's like mine, it has lots of little bold numbers, so there's lots of little subsections that Paul addresses. So we'll take this chunks at a time. Someone please read 10 through 11, 2 verses.
But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that husband should not divorce his wife.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so here it's kind of interesting. Paul says, not I, but the Lord. And so it's easy to be like, well, are there things Paul's going to say that are his opinion, or are there things that he got straight from Jesus? Well, the idea seems to be that this is what Jesus said during his earthly ministry. It's not that Paul was just giving his opinion the rest of the time. We'll get to a part where he did. But, so he's basically like, here's what the Lord taught, like directly when he was on earth, so I'm going to re-give that instruction there. And so that's kind of neat. And just those little different perspectives you may not think about. Because in English, right, the way we're used to it, I'm not saying the Greek makes this that much clearer without kind of thinking through it, but what we're used to in our modern American vernacular, we're used to, here's what so-and-so said, but here's what I say. We kind of contrast it that way. Paul just seems to be referring to it as, here's what Christ taught on earth. I'm not giving anything that you haven't heard before, shouldn't have known. And so now he's talked about the widows, he's talked about people who are already married. He goes back to the people who are married. Christians, not Christians to non-Christians. He's talking about Christians married to Christians because of what we see later. So in all of this, you need the context to tease out who he's talking to, at least in parts of this. So later he'll talk about Christians married to non-Christians. Here it's Christians. To the married, I give instruction. Here's what Jesus said. The wife should not leave her husband, and obviously the husband and the wife too. If she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. Of course, keep it in context. There was apparently some idea, some movement towards celibacy among some of the Christians there. Obviously not all because of chapter 6 and their lasciviousness, but there was a movement towards celibacy by some of them. And we talked about maybe that's because of the example they saw in Paul. Maybe that's because some of their philosophical schools of thought in that area taught those things. Maybe it's because Jesus, right, he was that celibate as well. And so some of them were getting that idea, even married people. It's like, okay, we need to be, at least the idea is, yes, we're teasing out the meaning, but we're keeping it in context. So they're like, okay, well, the celibate life is the best life. And Paul's like, you're not equipped for that, and that's not how you treat your spouse. So these 2 verses, they assume the spouses are believers. Let's see, no one missing thing. So divorce is commanded against, and I know that in the churches of Christ, and a lot of people, right, there's a lot of situations that come up about lots of very bad situations in marriage. So all we know is it says that, should not divorce. I'll leave it at that. I'm not equipped to go beyond that. And it applies to men and women. Just like we've seen so far in this chapter, Paul is not degrading women. He's not playing favorites with the men. He's back and forth. Men do this, women do this. So it's back and forth, showing this kind of equality in the sight of God. Okay. Any questions on those 2 verses? And they're not all 2-verse sections. We're about to get to some bigger ones here.
I wonder if some of them thought too, like, was it the Thessalonians who thought that Jesus' return was going to happen any day, and so they didn't work, and maybe they thought, well, if he's coming right back, then we want to be more like Paul, more like Jesus. We want to be undefiled in their mind.
Yeah. And either that or, because some of them doubted the resurrection anyway, right? Well, and if there's no resurrection, what's it matter what we do with our bodies? And so there's just apparently a lot of views going on. It's very hodgepodge, very mixed up. They had their own kind of, potluck with their ideas, where people were bringing lots of things. Someone please read 12 through 16.
But to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife?
Thank you very much. Okay, so in these verses, verse 12, but to the rest I say, not the Lord. What does he mean by that? But you gotta prove your answer. What does Paul mean? Is he saying, is it his opinion? What's he saying?
It's his opinion.
You think it's his opinion?
It's his opinion.
Any other thoughts on that?
It sounds like his opinion.
It does, right? And how we are used to talking, it does. I would say it's not his opinion. Now, we haven't read the rest of the chapter yet, but look at verse 25. Now, concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. Verse 7, only as the Lord is assigned to each one. I would propose he's actually not giving his opinion because of how he words it. Later on, he's careful to say, this is my opinion. In this section, what is he saying? He basically is speaking in terms of command. She must not send her husband away. So the idea seems to be put forward that, just like in the previous section, Christ taught against divorce among his people. Here, Jesus did not ever openly address this issue in his public ministry. And so I don't know why Paul chooses to point back to that, but he's saying that even though Jesus didn't bring this up, and so any early gospel accounts or whatever, the Corinthians would not have seen that, Paul's like, this is still what God is saying. So I would propose to you it is not his opinion because of how he couches his opinion later and because of the way he words these. What do y'all think?
I guess he knew that he was inspired, and so this is inspired, but not something, like you said, not something that Jesus preached in his ministry.
Yeah. There were situations Jesus just did not address, right? Especially because, I guess back then, he was sent to the sheep of Israel, and he taught them how they were to behave. But yeah, so I would propose it is not his opinion for those reasons.
Yeah, just based on how the apostles were charged by God and then given the power and the revelation through the Holy Spirit, that anything they said in a teaching atmosphere, which this letter is obviously falls within that, would have been understood by the people of that time, the people he's writing to, the Christians, that it's a message from God.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it was something Jesus said while he was here or something Paul is saying now, it's a message from God. Except in those cases where Paul specifically says, now this is just my opinion.
Yeah.
But here he's not saying it's his opinion, he's saying this is what he's saying. In other words, this is the message that he's giving to them. And so I would lean towards saying, no, that's a revelation from the Lord there in verses 12 and forward.
Yeah, through the Spirit, or however that worked, but yeah, not Not while Jesus was on earth, but yeah, definitely, still as
Yeah,
blind.
he was just differentiating that, hey, this thing is actually something Jesus said, so it kind of helps him to give weight to that
Yeah,
as an overarching principle, and then he has this further explanation, sort of a subheading for this particular situation. It seems like there was, like you said, this was an interesting time because there was so much new.
mm-hmm.
Even if you're talking 50, 60, 80, 100 years after Jesus, that's all still relatively early in the scheme of things, where the dust is still settling from all these changes. And it does seem like there were some, not all, but some who either came out of Judaism or came out of the world of, and such were some of you.
Yeah,
With
yeah.
all the idol worship and things like that. Whether they came out of either of those, there were some who, when they started following Christ, would go too far and burden themselves with rules that were not required of them. Sometimes ones that actually cause problems for other people.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, if you said, well, I've become a Christian and my spouse is not, so I need to leave my spouse.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I've got to cut off that hand because it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
And here's Paul saying, no, that's too far.
Yeah,
It's not
exactly.
what God wants.
Well said. Same with that, celibacy, whatever.
Yeah.
There were certain things that they were confused on. He had to redirect them too far this way, too far that way. Yeah. So some of it can be confusing because it's worded in ways different from how we think about it. But I think the context does help clear up a lot of this chapter. This has probably been one of my favorite parts of the study, is this chapter, just because it's always been, I guess, a little confusing. So, verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. What does that mean? Anytime we ask these questions, context, context, context. Well, at least, no, let me rephrase it. What does it not mean? That's probably the easier one.
It doesn't mean saved.
Yeah, true. How do we know that?
Because of the other teachings that we have on what it means to be saved. The context I'm taking for holy here is being made whole or legitimizing,
Mm-hmm.
rather than making pure or like saved.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think definitely it is absolutely not them being saved. And verse 16 bears that out too. How do you know if he'll save them? They're not saved, or else they'd be saved there. And so yeah, I think that idea, that wholeness you mentioned, that legitimizing it, either that marriage or giving them a chance to know the Lord and things like that, I think that's what he's getting at there. Why he chooses to word it these ways, I don't know. Because that's not what we would say, right? That's not how we think of things.
Is the original language the same
Yeah.
holy as, okay.
Yeah, I don't have the footnotes. I hadn't looked into that, but yeah,
Young's literal translation is word for word the same as that, which is not common. So that must mean that the language was very clear in the original Greek.
It's just worded in a way that we don't think of that, based on how that word's normally used in the Bible there. So in 15 and 16, ultimately, the believing man or woman, they don't have control over what the unbeliever does. The unbeliever does not recognize the authority of the Lord, and because of that, well, you can't make them stay. You can't tell them not to divorce. You can't do anything like that. They're going to do what they do. You can try and convince them, but don't oppose them in a way that's like, I guess, belligerent or commanding. You can try and persuade them perhaps, but he's just like, ultimately you can't stop them, and you need to let them go there. Even if you want to save them, which should be your desire, it doesn't mean you can. Now, here's one that we can get us in trouble, and that we do need to talk about. That is verse 15. So, yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. the brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Some will want to use that and say, well, if the unbeliever leaves, you're allowed to remarry again. That's not what the language is implying. So now we will get into the Greek a little bit. So it's a passive verb. Think what Clippy would tell you on Microsoft Word when a little paperclip comes up and says you're using a passive voice. So it's that verb, the aspect of verb, those action words that talk about what's happening to you rather than an action you were doing. Like, I don't know, I didn't come prepared with an example. I am, whatever, think of a verb. Whatever, y'all can think of it. I'm sorry, it's not coming to me. In English, we don't talk that way that much, right? But think of it, it's something that talks about what's happening to you rather than what you were doing. So regardless, sorry, that's off the wall. The idea, passive verb bound, is defined as, quote, to make someone a slave, or, quote, to make one subservient to one's interest. And that's going to be DAG Dictionary, well, that Greek dictionary that we often go to make one subservient to one's interests, to make someone a slave. It's not used in the marriage bond elsewhere in the Bible. It's a different Greek word from the one used in verse 39 of this chapter. Wife is bound to her husband, so that's a different verb. So the idea is that of being bound or obligated to keep the marriage together. It doesn't mean that the marriage bond is broken. It means that you can't keep them in you're not obligated to try and keep them together with you.
Here's an example. It's pretty good. Dustin was scratched by the cat.
The cat scratched Dustin. Thank
Yes.
you. Yes.
So-
See, it's easy. It just off the top of my head there.
Yeah.
That pressure got to me. No, thank you. So, regardless, the idea is, I was bound. They bound me. You are not bound to try and keep the marriage together. So, he's not saying the marriage bond is broken. He's saying you're not obligated to keep them there with you. And the 4, verse 16, for how do you know, that explains what he's talking about. For how do you know a wife, whether you will save your husband? That's why he's saying you're not under bondage. You can't know if you can save them there. So this is one of those tricky sections that the world will try and use, or people, denominations. We need to understand what's going on there. So the word in verse 39 that I mentioned, that's to bundle something up, to tie something up to something else, or it talks of binding or imprisoning, not that marriage is a prison, or it can mean to constrain by law or duty. So that's from BDAG also. So it's a different word, different concept. Does that make sense? Hopefully I'm getting that across. So the marriage bond is not broken if the unbeliever leaves. It's still intact, but you're not obligated to try and keep them together, to keep them with you. So I know we don't all like language studies, but that one's important. We need to understand what's going on there, because the English doesn't always capture the flavor of what's up.
And that, like you said earlier, that is a passage that a lot of people will use to justify
Yeah.
actions.
Yeah. And those little landmines, difficult things that Paul teaches, that people twist. Okay, if everybody's happy, or even unhappy, we're still going on. So hopefully not unhappy. Someone please read 17 through 24. And as we do it, just keep in mind, keep the context. It sounds different, sounds outside the context, but it's not. So 17 through 24.
Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this way let him walk. And so I direct in all the churches. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He is not to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Each person is to remain in that state in which he was called. Were you called as a slave? Do not let it concern you. But if you are also able to become free, take advantage of that. The one who was called to the Lord as a slave is the Lord's freed person. Likewise, the one who was called as free is Christ's slave. You were bought for a price. Do not become slaves of evil. Brothers and sisters, Each one is to remain with God in the condition in which he was called.
Thank you very much. Okay, that sounds way out of left field. What is Paul doing here? But what's the context? We're talking about marriage bonds. We're talking about those obligations and so forth. And especially verse 17 has it start, only as the Lord has assigned each one. So he's continuing that thought. He didn't go off and say, okay, we're done here. No, he's continuing that thought, and because it's sandwiched in the middle of this context on marriage. So, and he uses a few different examples here that can sound kind of weird, but they're not, right? Verse 18 through 20, you call while circumcised. Was any man called when he was already uncircumcised? He's not to become uncircumcised. So apparently, from what they tell me, there was a surgery back then that could help undo the effects of circumcision, or at least make it look like it. So even back then, they had little procedures and surgeries and stuff. I don't know if it was outpatient or what. So they can do things like that. I guess some of the Jews were embarrassed about it or whatever. And so he's not just, I don't think he's just now suddenly talking about Judaism and Judaizers. He seems to be making the point, if you're married, you stay married. You know, if they divorce, you stay divorced, and such. He's just using different examples to help bring that out. And remember, Paul circumcised Timothy because his father was a Greek, so it's not like he's absolutely forbidding circumcision for those who are uncircumcised. No, he's using that as an example, driving a point home.
And it all comes back to the point that our Christian life is more inward than outward.
Mm-hmm.
The outward signs, whatever they might have been, are not nearly as important as what's in your heart, what you think and believe and do.
Yeah, all those signs done away with, those garment, even the food and things like that. So wearing material made of two different types, or clothing and so forth, all those things. Yeah, the circumcision.
Yeah, I like this section because it just really underscores the fact that Paul wanted the people there to understand that God's word, the new covenant, was for all people, in all situations. And so we find it 100% applicable to us still today. And 2,000 years from now, it will still be applicable to people in whatever strange new science fiction world they live in. That it applies to everyone in all situations can enjoy the benefits of a relationship with Christ, even if it proves difficult in some areas. God has instruction on how to go about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's true. And it may take a little dissecting or translation and interpretation, but the point's clear. We understand it because, we can put it together, like Casey, like you were saying, with the other things that we've read. And so we know the general principles of the Lord there. But yeah, absolutely. So verse 21 and 22 talks about being a slave. And he ends the section, verse 23, do not become slaves of men. So again, I don't think he's really talking about physical slavery. As an aside, he mentions if you are a slave, you can be free to do that. But he seems to sum it up with, don't become slaves of men, remain with God in that condition in which you were called. Again, the context, marriage and stuff. So he just uses physical examples to bring it up. Things he seemed to expect them to understand what he was talking about. So perhaps not being slaves of human wisdom, as Gordon Fee mentions, and the teachings that were causing them problems has moved towards celibacy, or whatever it was, again, as you talked about them going too far. We were bought metaphorically, remember what we just reviewed in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. So Christ purchased us with his blood there. And so we are slaves, so to speak, of him, slaves of righteousness, reflecting him in what we do. Okay, we are marching on. Any questions up to this point? Just making sense? It's not bad, right? It seems like an intimidating chapter, but when you remember the context and when you compare the sections to help clarify each other, it helps make sense, I think. Someone please read 25 through 31.
Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for you to remain as you are. Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in life, and I want to spare you this. What I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away.
Thank you. Another one of those weird sections that's easy to just get wrapped up in. You think it's an eschatological or end times kind of thing. No, it doesn't seem to be the idea there. See, now this one, again, now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion. So he seems to be very clear when he's bringing that out. So again, I think that helps us interpret the earlier stuff we talked about, though it sounds like he's giving an opinion. I understand that. So now he's talking about those who weren't married or who aren't married. Earlier he talked about the widows and widowers, it seems. He talks about those who are already married. Now he moves on yet again to different people there. So verse 25, virgins, either talking about women who have never married or women who are engaged to marry. And there's the thought that maybe in the church, remember all the different ideas flowing around. Maybe he's talking about them being pressured not to marry if they were engaged. And so Paul has to clarify, here's how you approach that situation. Because there were people pushing celibacy, there were people who, they were acting however they wanted to. And so now he seems to be addressing those women there. So either view, right, fits the context, whether they were just not married or they were engaged, something like that. And God had not given Paul a commandment, which means that this is an area of freedom. And in their context, there was some crisis, some distress going on. God was giving them freedom to act how they wanted, but Paul's like, well, with freedom, with great power, Uncle Ben, right? With great power comes great responsibility. I don't know if Uncle Ben took that from someone, but I'll credit Uncle Ben for saying that. So God did not give him a commandment, but Paul's like, this still is worthy of bringing up and addressing there. And he talks about, by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. We saw that in chapter 4. It's incumbent upon a steward to be trustworthy, to be found trustworthy. So he's building himself up a little bit in their sight, or maybe slighting them a little bit. Not maliciously, but chiding them. Like, by the way, you probably should listen to me. So, what do y'all think? What was the current or impending distress, crisis, whatever? The Greek word can mean either current or impending. So it's either happening or about to happen. What was it? Good answer, because that's what the commentators think too. No one knows. No one knows. The idea is maybe some kind of persecution or some kind of problem related to marriage. Obviously the context there, something that made it more difficult. They just don't know. Of course, when you have a small pocket of people who really stand out, even if it's not a widespread persecution, you can have some hostilities. Like think of the early days of the Mormons, right, and what they were doing. Things didn't go too well for them, as I understand it. So people didn't like the new stuff. Think about if you had a little pocket of Christians in the Middle East or in China that were open about their beliefs. You're going to get some resistance, whatever it was. And keep in mind, Paul took these people from their culture, from their families, from their co-workers. Not that he kept them away from them, but everything they were used to doing. Eating these idol's meals, these meals honoring their ancestors. He took them from all of that. Like, you are different now. And when you do things like that, you're just going to stand out. Think what Peter would say. he'd say that they are surprised that you don't run with them in these same excesses of dissipation and drunkenness and so forth, and that they're going to speak badly of you because of it. So as soon as you're different in a way that calls the world out, the world don't like that. The world not happy. So, but we don't know. That's Dustin's opinion, which, what it's worth. So, but he didn't say. Either way, they knew what it was. And if something were to happen today that were to make marriage more difficult, whatever, if the government started imposing regulations on marriage or whatever that just made it more difficult, then, we could give the same advice today. Probably better not to marry, even though God doesn't forbid it. Hopefully that makes sense. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you haven't sinned. Virgin marries, she has not sinned. She will, but yet such will have trouble in this life, and I'm trying to spare you. So he still cared about them. He still sought their good. Now, Paul does not mention the marriage exception or the adultery exception for divorce and remarriage here, though his wording here does not change that truth. So I don't know why he does not mention it, but it's brought up clearly in Matthew. So something to keep in mind. So he's already said that some should seek marriage, like the widow should seek marriage to help with temptation. And so he's not ruling out anything he just said. He's just like, there's a lot to consider in these circumstances, and you need to take it into account, first of all. He doesn't say they should not marry. He's just like, well, you should know, here's what's going to happen. He does hold firm that divorce is not an option, so that does not change either. He's consistent with himself and with God's teachings. And 29 through 31, the time has been shortened, so you should act like you don't have a wife, or if you weep, as you don't weep. And so, again, he uses these very big terms, almost apocalyptic kind of sounding stuff. But he's just saying that, it seems to be saying, you need to be careful, you need to be sober-minded, you need to make sure that you're able to handle this temptation and be prepared for that. Don't do things like divorce, but just be ready for what's coming or what's already here. You just need to be strong and sober-minded there. See if I missed anything. And of course, in their situation, yes, being Christians would have really made them stand out. But even today, what Christ did changed the very form of the world, right? His teachings, whether people acknowledge it as coming from him or not, that spread throughout the world, that morality, that love, and so forth there, it's had a ripple effect throughout history there. So in that sense, the form of the world, the appearance of the world, whatever that word means, has it means form, outward appearance, or way of life, according to B-Day. So all of that is changing in their circumstance, and it's changed to this day. We grew up, or many of us grew up and lived in a culture that is pro-Christianity, or at least accepts it. That may be changing, so the form may be changing the other way. So hopefully that made sense. Things to take away. They knew what he was talking about. Be smart and follow God's commandments, but make sure you're acting in a way that will help you serve the Lord. Okay. If everybody's good, we'll hit the next few verses. If not, questions? 32, but I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. And his interests are divided. The woman who is unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. This I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. And that sums up probably the last several verses there. He's like, I'm not binding these things, but keep in mind where your priorities are. And naturally, the married people will have some obligations toward each other. That takes them away from a more spiritual focus. And even though these things were given in a context, remember, or take note that Paul seems to be wording them in general ways. Even today, the married person is concerned about the things of the world, so to speak. Not that they're not concerned about spiritual things, but their interests are divided. And the unmarried should be focused on the things of God there. More so, with more time and more opportunity to do that.
Do you think that, I don't know if I'll say this or not, that this, Paul's ideas there go against the teaching in Genesis about it's not good for a man to be alone?
I think there's an aspect in which that's true, like that it's not good for a man to be alone. And that's a general truth, I would say. And even then, God gave them both a charge in the Lord, like, fill the earth and subdue it and all this stuff. So they were to work together. Now, if Adam were by himself, things obviously would have been a lot different. We wouldn't be here, I guess. But I don't think it's saying it's bad. I think they're just, when we examine any of these things, I think there are senses in which they are true, but we can't make it the absolute. So, it's not good. Like, there's the difficulties of life that are eased by having that faithful companionship and stuff. But yeah, there are ways in which it takes you away from a spiritual focus because you have obligations toward helping each other in body and keeping each other encouraged and strengthened and stuff.
Do you think he's still referring back to the present distress, or is it more general?
I think he is back talking about the present distress, but I want you to be free from concern, and then he kind of seems to be explaining what that means. So I think in that context it does fit as well. Not that there's not general truths we can take from it either.
Yeah.
So, thank y'all for your good attention and feedback. We almost finished chapter 7, but that was real good, so appreciate it.